Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Lee Whitmore with the Focusrite Group. I am so pleased to be here to welcome all of you to our second episode in the Focusrite Group in Education series, Pro Audio and Education. Today's installment, our second episode, is studio recording and production essentials for your college program. And we have some amazing panelists and a wonderful panel moderator. I'll start by saying Focusrite Group in education includes Focusrite and Focusrite Pro, Novation, Martin Audio, Atom Audio, Amplify Music. Sequential is a part of our family now, and it is just absolutely wonderful to have you all here. Focusrite Group's commitment to education is substantial, and we are here to be a supportive partner for you, for your program. As we work through the webinar today, a couple of things that you all should know before I introduce our panel moderator. One, as you're watching the live stream, feel free to jump into the YouTube chat, ask questions. We, in fact, will pass those in to our panel. So if you have questions as we go through the conversations today, don't hesitate to ask. And if we have so many, as happened last time, and ran out of time, we'll still make sure that you get answers to all of your questions today. So again, it's great to have you here. We have an amazing panel. Ask questions as we go through in chat. We will field those. And again, we're here for the second episode in Focusrite Group's Pro Audio and Education webinar series, studio recording and production essentials for your college program. Without any further ado, I'm very happy to introduce our panel moderator today, a dear friend and colleague of mine who is at Berklee in the Music Production and Engineering Department, is the live sound engineer and has a director's role at NPR's From the Top, is a board member for the record company nonprofit recording facility in Boston, and so many other things. John Escobar. John, it's so good to see you here today. It's great to have you back. I'm going to pass it on to you because I know we have lots of really exciting things to talk about with our panel, and I'll leave it to you to introduce the rest of our panelists for today. So thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Lee. And first of all, I just want to thank Lee and the entire Focusrite Group team for putting this webinar series together, for having me be part of it. And I just think it's such an incredible mission that they're trying to promote, not just education, but education to such a wide-reaching audience. So thanks for putting this together. Thanks for having us all here, and thank you all for joining us today. As Lee said, we have an incredible group of panelists with us today. It's an incredible honor to get to be here speaking with all of them, and we've got some really interesting conversations. So without further ado, I'd like to start introducing everybody, have you all come on screen, and then give everybody a chance to tell our audience a little bit more about yourselves. So we have Diana Tenorio, who is a mixing engineer for streaming content at Cinematic Media in Mexico. Carlos Freitas, multi-Grammy Award-winning mastering engineer, now based in Florida. Brian Smithers, the audio production program director for Full Sail University, and Dr. Chandler Bridges, the associate professor of audio engineering and sound production at Indiana University. Thank you all so much for being with us today. It's such an honor to get a chance to talk with you. And I'd like to just go around the room and give everybody a chance to make their own introductions, tell our viewers who you are, where you're working from, and if you're free to talk about it, maybe a couple of the projects that you're currently involved with, or, you know, for the educators on the panel, a little bit more about your programs and what their focus is. So Diana, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind.
Sure. Hi everyone. Hello, John. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Diana, and I'm a mixing engineer for Cinematic Media here in Mexico City. I'm working with in Martin Hernandez and Alejandro Quevedo's team. We do mostly streaming content. And we are currently mixing our first Atmos series. So this is very challenging for us.
Very challenging indeed. And we're certainly going to spend some time in a moment, all of us sort of sharing our experiences with Atmos and just with the sort of general state of digital audio and audio workflow. Thanks so much for being with us and for sharing. Carlos, I'll go over to you next.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with all of you. Thanks for Focusrite and people from Focusrite Education. I'm a Brazilian audio engineer, more focused on mastering. I've been working with mastering more than 25 years. And nowadays I'm living here in Miami, but all my career was made in Brazil, about 25 years with mastering, now two years here in Miami. And nowadays I'm working, I still work with mastering in 2-track, but I started to work with Atmos universe. And as Diana said, it's been a challenge because it's a new technology, it's a new for everybody. We don't have a reference yet. So all things that we are doing, we are breaking rules, breaking walls, and that's it. It's been amazing to work with Atmos, and I'm so excited to do. And also work with restoration and mastering for 5.1, for 2.0, but Atmos is on the spot now.
Yeah. Let's see how long it takes Dolby to coin that phrase, the Atmos universe. I like that. I'm gonna move over to Chandler.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Chandler Bridges. I'm teaching at the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And a little bit about our program. We have a 60-person audio engineering sound production department here, and we support over 1,100 concerts, from small ensembles. Tonight we have an orchestral performance and have a lot of opera. And so it's always exciting to see how technology changes and inspires us to make the changes. In the way that we stream live, all of our productions are streamed live as well. And we are also doing, just finished building an Atmos room. And so the adventure continues.
Beautiful. I do a fair amount of sort of orchestral and classical, so it's going to be a lot of fun sort of sharing notes and seeing where we're seeing technology evolve in that world. And last but not least, of course, is Brian.
Hey, John. Hey, everyone. Glad to be with you today. So I've been teaching at Full Sail University for a little over 21 years. Prior to that, I was a staff musician at Walt Disney World for a decade and a half. And here at Full Sail, we have 4 programs in the recording and audio area. One of them is our flagship recording arts program, which really kind of founded the school more than 40 years ago. From that, we grew into a show production program, then a music production composition program, and most recently, the program that I'm in charge of, which is the online audio production degree program. So we cover production from a lot of different directions and try to steer people in the right direction with regard to what they need to be thinking about and listening for.
Excellent. Well, I guess let's move on to our first topic for the day. And last episode we sort of focused on COVID's impact, which has been a very direct impact on the industry and how workflows change. But I think over the last decade or so, we've seen an incredible increase or an incredible change in the way that technology is being used and being developed for audio purposes, especially digital audio. And it's sort of ramped up. And I personally feel like actually the last couple of years of this whole COVID pandemic has kind of exacerbated it. And it's made it so that even though we've been thinking and hearing about buzzwords like immersive audio and spatial audio and Atmos and all of this, it's been in the background for a few years now. but I feel like the fact that we were all at home and all had a little bit of maybe extra time or extra energy to devote to these things, all of a sudden it really is here. It's landed. I wasn't around for it, but it sort of feels like what I imagined going from mono to stereo was like, where there's sort of two camps, but quickly there's a growing camp of people that really feel like this is it. This is where we are. This is where we need to evolve. And I think what we're all seeing is that our workflows, the way that we think about not just creating audio, but delivering that audio, translating the deliveries to our user base is very much changing. It's all up in flux. And I'm curious how that's impacting each of you in the different areas where you are, So for instance, maybe I'll start with Diana. How are you spending your time with immersive audio? You mentioned that you're just working on your first series in Atmos, and so how has that changed your workflow, or has it changed your workflow from what it previously was?
Well, I always mixed in 5.1, and that was the change. What we do now is that thanks to all the new technologies, we expand our team because they don't necessarily need to be here in the studios. With the softwares and the different tools, we can have more people in different areas, and this makes more efficient our workflow.
I'm curious, is the expansion of the team localized to Mexico and Latin America, or are you now global?
We are now global. We can make the team don't necessarily be in the country or on the continent. We could make the team more have more diversity.
And maybe this is a question for the group in general, but are we finding that working in Atmos while allowing us to sort of spread out, what's the challenge in terms of that team workflow dynamic? Before when you're working in channel-based audio, I send Chandler my stems and my stereo mix, and it's a very unilateral back and forth. Do we feel like Atmos breaks that protocol, or is it sort of the same thing? Does it allow us to simultaneously work on a project from different angles, or what do we think?
Well, as far as what we experienced going back to the beginning of the pandemic is how were we going to be able to have musicians at the Jacob School record and be parts of ensembles? And so we equipped everybody with some Focusrite 2i2s, and we tried to figure out sending files back and forth. And I'll be honest, it was challenging. A lot of people on Zoom, and Zoom has been amazing. StreamYard is amazing. But as far as latency and issues like that in collaboration, I mean, it was quite a challenge. And I'm curious to hear about others' experiences with that as well. I think the thing for me that most stands out about Atmos, and I'm looking at this from more of a music perspective, it's entrenched in the film world, and we understand that. But if you think back, my parents' generation was super excited about quad. I was excited when multi-channel deliveries came around, 5.1, 7.1, all these ideas were incredible, but it just didn't seem like people were willing to set up the speakers. They just weren't, they didn't have the desire to figure out the angles or where they were going to go or drill the holes or run the wires. And so for me, the big change with Atmos is Apple Music and the other streaming services and other retailers now, and using the binaural delivery system. I think that it is because it can be delivered binaurally that this has a chance. I used to hope, if everybody just have 5.1 in their car, then we could all start to mix it and surround. And I'll be honest, in my world, that didn't take hold. And so again, this is aside from in the film arena, but in the music side of things, was always hoping for surround to really entrench itself and get more traction. And I think we have a shot now because of Atmos and that binaural delivery. A little off of what you asked, but
no, but you're right, and you bring up a good point, which is that we were actually just talking about that is sort of how do we control where and how our clients or our audience is listening to this. And so maybe for Chandler and Brian, I'm curious how you all are thinking about what new levels of education or knowledge do our students need to have? And for Diana and Carlos, what is the new, like, what does the email have to say when you send your files to the clients in terms of, how to listen to this and the commentary that you're going to get back?
How many hours do we have today? Because that's a lot. If I can jump quickly on the first half of your question, building on what Chandler said, we've been through just about every virtual surround headphone product out there, from the Lake Theater phone that became Dolby headphone to a variety of different things from Biodynamic and companies that I can't even, Smythe Technology. I mean, there are some really cool things, and they've gotten progressively better, but it wasn't until recently that the actual technology of doing surround, whether 5.1 or fully immersive Atmos style surround in headphones, really became viable enough that everybody was like, okay, yeah, we're there. So the growth of that technology, the ability to actually get to that point, is probably even a bigger thing in my mind than the industry support. Apple Music supporting it is great. Amazon Music is supporting it in their way as well. So that's great. But from an education perspective, the ability to actually make this experience available to students, if you have dozens or hundreds or thousands of students and you've got one Atmos room, then how do you actually be sure that everybody gets an adequate education? Being able to actually do it in headphones, being able to actually conceivably let them work on their own and explore what it is they're working on is really revelatory. There's a supporting point to that with regard to technology, and that is the changing cost-benefit ratio on speakers. Smaller, better, less expensive speakers that allow us to get further in any given room than our budgets would have taken us previously. So from an educational perspective, the first thing and the last thing is, how do we get them to be able to actually hear what it is they're being expected to do? We can talk about and should talk about delivery formats and all the technical things that go into it, but getting them to actually be able to hear it and understand how that works and how it works in headphones and how it works in room and how it does or doesn't translate, that's step one.
Yeah, very interesting. And you're right. The listening part and the being sort of knowing how to hold yourself back from the possibilities that you now have available to you is a big challenge. I was just listening to some student work yesterday, and it's amazing how, now that you have just because you have the ability to move everything around a virtual room doesn't mean you necessarily should. Just like you have the ability in stereo to pan back and forth every eighth note doesn't probably mean you should. So sort of learning what you're supposed to be listening for, I think, is absolutely part of the educational challenge. Carlos, I'm curious from your perspective, and you said that you've been doing a lot of Atmos mastering work. How is that changing both your workflow, but also how you approach a delivery for a commercial client?
I started for a few months, and I started mastering singles. So work with a single, it's pretty easy because you don't have to listen all in sequence or something like that as an album. And I received all this mix, the song mixed in Atmos. I received a bed and 4 or 5 object tracks. So it's easy to work. You know, as Chandler told us, I started to work with stereo, then with mastering for 5.1. In Brazil, we produce it on last 15 years, thousands of DVDs. So I worked a lot with 5.1. So when I started to receive in Atmos, it's kind of upgrade for 5.1. So for me, it's easy to understand the environment, to use more speakers or something like that. So another thing that Brian told us, that's correct. A guy that is start to work with music now and have a lot of speakers, a lot of options, how to deal with all this kind of tools, it's a really challenge. So for me, I start to pay attention to the loudness normalization and all technical specifications from Dolby, and I delivered MP4 for the producer for listening, and then an IDM. But last week I received an album to mastering in Atmos. So it was completely different because they mixed song by song, and I mastered the 2-track album 3-4 months ago. So I had a very good reference to do the mastering for Atmos, but when I put all at the same line in a sequence and start to listen, it was necessary to rebalance a lot of stuff, like vocals, for example. Some music vocals are pretty high, and then it was necessary to put a little bit back. So a lot of EQs, it was different to do this, but it's all the same process.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is how to listen it. So I'm delivering a binaural wave and also a MP4 for listening. But the main thing, the best way is to the producer stay with you and listen with you at your room with speakers to make some decisions. So I think for complete that, as a master engineer, mastering a Dolby mix, I have more responsibility with all because I'm changing some things, you know. So this is a this is a really challenge, but it's possible to do this, but it's more responsibility than on mastering for 2 tracks.
Sure. We're once again blurring the lines between what is the mix and what is the master in a whole new way. And we'll get to talking about more of that in a moment. But I think before that, it feels like we've all sort of described certain elements of our workflow and how it's changed and the challenges, both from an education standpoint and a workflow standpoint. So it feels like a perfect moment to talk about sort of what are the tools that we need to be paying attention to, or that our students, for those of us in education, need to be aware of and thinking about. I know that, some of the challenges that we see at Berklee is that, for instance, and Brian and I were having a discussion about this earlier, where, analog audio is a very linear process, and it's very simple to follow through your signal flow. And digital audio inherently breaks that entire concept, or allows you to break that entire concept. And especially now, Atmos breaks it yet again, because you're adding even more layers of complexity and ways and places that you're going with things, and you're isolating certain objects and you're not isolating others, and it's sort of like you were continually stacking on layers of complexity. So where I am seeing my students really struggle is in trying to grasp the no longer tangible quality of routing audio from device to device, right? So we're spending a lot more time thinking about clocking. What is clock? What devices need clock? Why do they need clock? And maybe more importantly, their interconnectivity. How can they actually interconnect? What protocols are they interconnecting via? And every single device, unfortunately or fortunately, has a different layer or way that they're using chiclet-based I/O structure, right? So we're spending more time looking at Dante, at RedNet, at Pro Tools I/O, at Logic I/O, at anything that gives me a way to move things back and forth. To the point where we actually, Focusrite was gracious enough to send us a rack full of equipment, which we just got. And the entire purpose of that rack is to give our students a way to build and break a system, a digital system, without the repercussions of, hey, in 2 hours, somebody's going to come in here and need to use the studio. So don't break it too much, So what are your workflows? What are your systems comprised of? Diana, I know that Horacio Malvecino recently worked on your facility. So I'm wondering what kind of equipment you all are working with, and how that's sort of integrated, and for all of you, what equipment are we dealing with, and what should people be aware of?
Yeah, so we have in Mexico City here at the Cinematic Studios, we have 4 Atmos studios and 2 7.1, 5.1. We interconnect with Dante and the RedNet equipment. So this is Dante and RedNet makes everything more easy to the routes, and this is a lot of challenge too for we as engineers to the new setups for Pro Tools and for the sessions in which we work, and we're still in trial and error with our sessions, our mixing sessions, how it's more easy to work and to have a more efficient workflow.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned that your team has sort of really expanded and gone global, I know that over the pandemic, one thing that I began doing a lot more of, and it's sort of a new challenge, is remote controlling systems. That's become a very commonplace thing for me to do. Is that part of how you all are working and in sort of collaborating with people remotely? Like, are people actually remote controlling your Atmos stage, for instance?
Yeah, we mostly, the people that are in other places is our editors.
Okay.
They are our editors, and the mixing process is still here. But everyone has an Atmos session already set up, and the editors are with these new routings, making it more easy to work.
Yeah, and I imagine that inside of your facility, a Dante system is integral to that, because you actually don't need to necessarily transfer the files back and forth from room to room. You can just send the audio from room to room. So that's a huge advantage, I imagine. I'm curious, in the other education programs, Chandler and Brian, maybe let's start with Chandler. I don't know much about your program.
Sure. Yeah, we've got the Dante protocol going. Students in our program get the Dante level 1 and level 2 certification. That way they start to understand how this all fits together. And with the large number of programs that we support, concerts that we support each year, all of our students get the opportunity to play a lot of different roles. We've just recently switched all of our halls over to Dante-based systems. And so, for example, Monday when we had a jazz band play, we've got a monitor mixer on the side of the stage getting a Dante feed. We've got a front of house engineer receiving a Dante feed. We live stream everything. So we've got a console upstairs and a booth that's receiving a Dante feed, mixing live to go out for the stream, and then a Pro Tools system receiving a Dante feed. And one of the first things I like to teach is that, set up playback engine. That's your whenever you have an issue, troubleshooting. But then, of course, the next step, a little more sophisticated, is that I/O setup. And I think that, as you mentioned, it's the chiclets. And, if you get one of those off, and if you're not familiar with Dante yet, I'm sure you will be. This protocol is amazing. It's really changing everything for us, and it really is quite simple once you wrap your head around the workflow and the signal flow. And for us, I think that's always the foundation. Is we try and I at least in my teaching try and start with analog signal flow and lay out those basics and get students to start thinking methodically about where is the signal going and how is it going. And then, John, as you mentioned, I mean, it just explodes with Dante, because now all of a sudden it's not like the signal's going in one way, and we can make some transfers with auxiliary sends and things, but we're taking the signal and distributing it so many different places, and so many different engineers are using it all at the same time. I mean, I think it's tremendous technology, and for us it's been incredible. It's been such a game changer.
I'd like to hop over to Carlos, because I know that typically, or it used to be, that a lot of your workflow was analog, and I'm wondering if you've, there's the little Dante analog to Dante dongle that you can get. I'm wondering if you've integrated any of that to be able to continue to use your analog equipment inside of your new system. Yeah.
Yes, I'm using the Red 16, and I have 4 tracks analog I can use all my Manley stuff for my Maslax, and I still using the analog gears. And my system is simple because I use mainly 2 tracks, and I'm using the Dolb render and Pro Tools at the same machine. So the only I use just a little of Dante with my controller, but I mastered in 2014 all the music from Olympic ceremony in Rio, and we worked in all Brazil, receiving songs from all Brazil, and we used the Avid Cloud, Pro Tools Cloud, and a lot of bugs, and it's not so easy to deal with real-time sending songs and something like that. So nowadays, listening Chandler speaking, how could be amazing work on Olympic Games mastering with Dante technology, because all mixes were done in Rio, in Recife, and I was in Sao Paulo. And, with this technology, I think that my job could be so easy to do. And I hope so to start to work with some studios in Brazil using Dante to receive songs for mastering in real time, or working with some producer in real time, doing the mastering, and he listening by Dante in real time on her Pro Tools. I don't know. The possibilities are so big that I can't imagine how can I implement some ways to work closer with clients, producers, and artists, because nowadays this is the new era, in my opinion, for production. My studio is in my home, and it's a very good studio. It's not a home studio like old days. It's a very professional home studio. And I've been working with all around the world, in Australia, in Spain. So I think that this new area of technology don't fits perfectly because it's easy, it's safe. And I think that we should think how we will improve our work with collab process. This is my goal for the next month, is to start to integrate more my room with the rooms in Brazil, and even with artists' personal studios. I don't know, but the perspective is so high.
You're right, and you bring up a really good point. You know, one of the beautiful things and the benefits of digital audio is that ability to immediately globalize yourself. You know, last week I was essentially in Singapore working on something, but I was here, you know,
Yeah.
and that's something that you just can't do. As much as I love a Neve or an API, it's not really possible like that, you know? So actually that opens the door perfectly to a question a viewer is bringing in, and I'm going to let Brian handle this one. And the question is, you know, when you're thinking of creating a room that could be Atmos or immersive audio capable, especially on a campus, what kind of requirements are we talking about?
Well, there are a lot of different aspects to that. Not to humble brag, but one of the challenges that we face is that we have literally dozens of surround facilities on our campus. And so upgrading any and all of these is a ginormous undertaking. And one of the things that we've run into is that the physical space that you put Atmos in needs to be actually a bit bigger and a bit better sounding than it did for 5.1. You've got sounds coming from different locations. Generally speaking, a surround room needs to be a pretty good sounding room. The classic idea that stereo near fields are closer to you than the reflections are, so the room doesn't matter as much, is no longer in play. You actually have to have a room that has, reasonable levels of reverberation. It can't be like just completely bone dry, or you're not going to get the reflections that give you spatial cues. And in Atmos, that's, that goes this way as well as, the other directions. The other question, from a pragmatic educational perspective, is how many students is this room designed for? It would be nice to, build a nice big, 20-foot wide mix studio with tricked out Atmos that every student could spend hours at a time in, but that's not a practical thing. So you have to be sure that you've got a room that can actually work with whatever number of students you're committed to working with. So we have some individual private rooms, but we also have some big classrooms and a dubbing stage where we can work with larger groups of students. So and those may sound a little bit evasive, but there are some kind of fundamental questions that you have to answer before you even start to answer the question that I think you're really getting at, which is it needs to be big enough acoustically, it needs to be controlled enough acoustically, and it needs to obviously have adequate network and power infrastructure which would go in for any studio. Things like reflections off the console become even more important when you've got sound coming from as many directions as you do. Are you able to, and is it sufficient for your needs to have students working primarily in the binaural mode? That simplifies things a lot, but it's only part of the experience. Carlos was talking earlier about the hoops he has to jump through to be sure that both the binaural version of the mix and the actual physical space version of the mix are both satisfactory, and sometimes there are compromises that need to be made. So recognizing the differences is another thing. So it's a great question. There's obviously no real simple answer, but those are a lot of the things that we've been pondering with regard to developing out specific spaces. Which ones do we prioritize? Which ones are going to take the greatest amount of work to actually adapt? So I hope that helps. And if it doesn't, hit us with a follow-up question and we'll try harder.
I think that's an incredible attempt at a very difficult question. So I'm going to sort of take a left-hand turn here and move the conversation to something a little bit more about content creation itself, and maybe how this workflow is being implemented there. And it's really the age-old question of, first and foremost, what is mixing versus what is mastering? And Carlos kind of alluded to that a moment ago when you were describing how much more complex your mastering workflow has now become because of the Atmos requirements. Maybe let's have the mastering engineer in the space answer the question of, really theoretically, what should the line be between mixing and mastering? Carlos, sorry, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Well, this is a good question. At the CD era, when I remember that I received people on my room with analog tapes. So you put your tape, play, pass through analog stuff, go to a workstation, produce a sequence, the codes, and then prepare a master physical for delivery. So the master engineer became the last here for quality control and send a perfect mastered CD for a factory to be replicated. So when we lost the CD media, when we lost the media, this part of job for master engineers disappeared, and people finish the mix. Why I will send to a master engineer so I can do this here and send it to Spotify or something? One step of my job disappeared. It's gone. So people start to mix and master together without the compromise with the delivery specifications. Nowadays, of course, we have the loudness recommendations and something like that, but you can do your mastering before mix or together. If you don't want to experience a new ear or some, I don't know, the experience of engineer. But with Atmos, it's now another thing, because you finish your mix and you don't have time to stay checking between speakers, between headphones, binaural, stereo. The stereo version for AG tracks or some other, I don't know, RCD, vinyl, I don't know. You have one song to be delivered in a lot of formats. No, I'm doing a work now. The guy asked for me, yeah, I need the mastering for CD, vinyl, Atmos, 2-track stereo. So the master engineer became again the quality control and the responsible for put all together and deliver for the specific formats correctly. So I think that nowadays the master engineer will have much more work to do, considering the quality control. And this is, for me, is the most important thing on Atmos, is the quality control, to be sure that your song will play correctly through the the all kind of speakers or ways or medias or whatever. So I think that when I think this only streaming area to track, mix and mastering become all together, and sometimes you have no compromise with delivery, only with a hot song. It's it's like a mix with a bombed mix. You know, you put a lot of things on this mix and punch or whatever without any compromise of where this song will be played. So I think with Atmos, change everything. And in a other way, some work that I do, I'm sending to TV. It's another protocol. It's another loudness normalization. So I have this experience to work and listen with all environments. So I think that nowadays, more than ever, the master engineer is so important for the production chain. And I would like to say just one thing, as Brian is speaking. Atmos is an egocentric listening. So this is another thing that is hard to, you stay here in a specific point listening. If you put 1 meter here, 1 meter, you lost all the information that came from speakers. So for me, binaural listening is more important nowadays, more than ever, than the speakers. So just to complete.
Diana, and I'd like to know from your perspective with visual media. That's another big question that gets asked all the time is how does a film or TV mixer think about the mastering process, and where is that line, and what are the kinds of protocols that they need to be following?
Yeah, the requirements is we'll see more about loudness, but as Carl said, mixing and mastering, it's almost the same thing here in mixing for post-production, because we are always facing with loudness and the requirements for the deliveries that we have to give for streaming devices. As I said at the beginning, the most challenge we have is how it will translate for the everyday devices that not necessarily have or reproduce Atmos, and that's what we are still learning, how to give our mix to translate and to translate the best form for the final device.
Yeah, and one thing that comes to my mind is actually both you and Carlos have alluded to the same thing, which is how do you actually control loudness in a format where your listener may not necessarily be in the center, right? They could be anywhere. So that becomes sort of a bigger challenge, or a new challenge that we haven't had to deal with before. I guess the next question I'd love to sort of tackle is, and this is something that a lot of my mixing students ask me, and Carlos sort of brought it up. So maybe it's a doubled question. The first is, what is our general consensus around the room on the mastering while you mix approach? I, in my professional work, I'm very much of the opinion that if I am deeply involved in the project from either a mix perspective, or actually even more importantly before the mix, if I was producing or recording the project, I should absolutely have nothing to do with anything that remotely resembles mastering. I just have nothing left by that point. And even in terms of just mixing, I have a really hard time sort of thinking about mastering while I'm mixing? Because in my brain, they're such different things creatively. You know, forget about loudness and preparing metadata and all of that stuff. So I'm curious what you all's thoughts are on that. Maybe Brian?
I'll jump in. So two things. One, I'm a genuine dinosaur. I only buy albums. I don't buy singles. I know that we've reverted to the mid 1960s, and it's a singles market again instead of an album market. And artists who produce primarily singles are just not artists that interest me. I like to sit down and listen to an album, and it's a thing. It's an experience. So that role that Carlos was referring to of the mastering engineer actually taking a bunch of stuff that was all mixed individually and making a cohesive whole out of it, that's a pretty important function that I think needs to be filled by a separate individual. The other thing is that I have heard so many tracks that sound as though someone mixed them through a finalizer set to stun, that I really wish that someone had come along and said, is that your final answer? Because maybe it shouldn't be. And backing off the snarkiness just a little bit, which I was, doing in good natured for effect mostly. That is another important role of the mastering engineer, is to say, here is my perspective on what you've done. It's what you were talking, John, about the separation of creative motive, separation of technical focus, and the ability to have someone that you respect and admire say, love what you've done. I think that, you should consider taking this approach. I think that it hits really hard without being squashed into a square wave. And here's the way that I think it will come across best to the widest audience. I think that's an important step for most musical productions.
I'm gonna throw the same question to Chandler and Diana from two different perspectives. From a music perspective, Chandler, and from a visual media perspective, what are some things that we can do in the mixing stage that would ultimately help the mastering chain without thinking about putting a mastering stun gun on our mix?
Well, I can comment on a couple things that have come up here. Is, this one thing that I find really interesting is when students come in to the program, I see them in an interview or when they first apply and I get to know them, they say that they want to be able to do it all. They want this army of one mentality. They want to be able to either be the musician, or if not interested in being the artist, they want to record, mix, master. They really want to know about mastering, Carlos. They want to know the secret behind all of that. And I think it's interesting to try and help them understand these differences, these different roles, like both John, you said, and Brian alluded to, is that, sometimes you're just too close to the forest to see the trees, and you've given all you have, and getting those extra ears on it, having Carlos come and put his ear and attention and be that last check is really important. The question to me is, where do we draw these lines? And as a tracking engineer, and track something or work with a producer or produce something, when is it done? I've been a mixing engineer and gotten sessions where things needed to be timed and tuned. And was that my responsibility or not? And sometimes, yes, it was my responsibility. And sometimes, no, they wanted it the way they had it. But more often than not, yes. And so I think we get into this issue of, well, if we're trying to make it sound as good as we can, what can we do to make it sound like a hit, sound like it's on the radio? And so, of course, this mastering idea starts to come into play. Classic question: when do we put a mix bus compressor on? Are you going to mix through the mix bus compressor? Are you going to mix and then put that compression on? And then we start to think about gluing everything together. And next thing you know, we've got 2 compressors on the mix bus and a limiter. And now we're kind of doing what would you call it, right? Pre-mastering. And so I think to your question, to wrap this up, and because I've opened up a couple cans of worms here, we have to leave room for the next person. And so if you have the luxury and the opportunity, and hopefully you do, to work with someone else, put their ear on it and have a mastering engineer and do that mastering stage, I mean, clearly you just don't want to overdo and deliver them something minus 0.3 dBFS. It just sounds like Brian's comment, and I've heard this many times before, the finalizer set to stun. So I think we just have to be careful about what are the roles and how do these different roles play out, and hope, for me in an educational setting, help students to realize and see that it doesn't have to be all done by yourself, and working in a team setting is actually beneficial in a lot of ways.
As I pass it over to Diana, I'm going to sort of grab onto something you just said, Chandler, which is, making sure that when are you done, sort of asking the question of when are you done? And I feel like digital audio has opened up that can of worms because we no longer have track count limitations, right? We don't necessarily have to be done when we track it. We don't necessarily have to be done at any time. We can always sort of leave off the decision till later. So from a visual media standpoint, Diana, and especially from a standpoint where inherently your job is all about collaboration. So what are you and your team members doing to help that dub stage be a little bit more successful when it gets there?
Well, here in post, we don't have the time to for mastering. We did it. We did with the mix already. We are very lucky because we are facing with a new format that is Atmos, and we are still learning how to and experimenting with how immersive audio works. We just in post-production audio, it's very easy to abuse of the LFE, and it's just to understand that we are lucky and working in an Atmos studio with nice monitors, but not everyone is going to hear in an Atmos studio and with big and nice monitors. So we are in the mix. We have to think in the final device. There are soundbars, and in Atmos we have the lucky that it's metadata, and it will translate easy in the soundbars, but not everyone currently have soundbars. So we are still think how to mix for the final device that is the everyday device that doesn't reproduce Atmos still.
Yeah, I wonder if at some point we're going to be, there's going to be a new thing called like micro mastering or something like that applies specifically to Atmos and what you just brought up, Diana, which is the objects and the fact that they are sort of a little micro world in and of themselves, and they have to sound as good as they can possibly sound on their own. My joke to classes has always been, you don't have to worry about what your guitar sounds like in solo because your audience doesn't have the ability to solo. Well, I guess I'm going to have to eat my words now in Atmos because maybe they will be able to do that, all incredibly great insight. I think each one of these topics that we've covered is days worth of conversation that we could have. But we don't have that time. And so I'd like to start wrapping things up. And as we wrap things up, I also leaving some room for questions. There's a couple of great questions coming in. But as we wrap things up, I'd like to go around the room and see what each one of you thinks is one important piece of advice that you might give one of the educators in the room, or a program head from a university that's preparing students, or one of the students themselves, in terms of what do they need to be paying attention to? What's important? You know, Diana, I'm sure there's a bunch of people watching us right now who are going, wow, they just expanded globally. How do I get to be on their team? You know, what do I need to know to be on a team like that? So I'm just going to go ahead and start with you, Diana, if you don't mind.
Well, I think it's very important to establish that you're really good at doing your job. That is the most important thing. To know that you don't know everything, and it is very helpful to offer assistance and share your knowledge to your colleagues. I think to be successful in any career, you need to focus on your goal. Ask you, why are you here, and what do you want to achieve? The discipline to achieve that goal, the soft skills, the discipline, to be able to think on your feet and work harder than ever you thought you are going to work, and just never give up. I think it's very important, the soft skills, as to prove that you're good in a work, and that is what we are looking for in our team: the attitude, the discipline, and be good.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love to hear that. It has nothing to do with the buttons and knobs, and you're absolutely right. That is the most important thing, is can you actually be responsible for the things that you're being asked to do? Really good. All the buttons and knobs come later. Carlos, what about you?
Well, for me, the main thing today is, although you play all instruments, don't try to be one man show or one band guy. You know, production is like a band. If you have a good musicians playing together, man, we will make a pretty good song. You know, so although we have all tools, we know it's important to understand and to know all parts of production. Be an expert in one, and try to focus more in one. Uh, I know how to mix, I know how to record, but I'm so focused on mastering. And mastering is much more than sound. I learned a very important thing when I studied at Berklee during my music production analysis course, that the emotional part of the song, you know, you sometimes you put 1 dB on 1 kilohertz, and the song goes, it appears, and it starts to make emotions. So for me, this is so important. Pay attention at the song, the music, not only on the sound.
Mhm.
You know. So for me, this is so important, and be patient. It's impossible to take shortcuts all the time. So it's important to, for me, it was so important to study in Berklee. Although I was so experienced and working a lot of time, when I completed my course in music production in Berklee, a lot of gaps were filled, and I became more comfortable to use emotional things or something like that. So study a lot, and don't try to use shortcuts all the time. Big things, we need some time to make it happen. So that's it.
I love that. Yeah, musicians first, technologists later. We're, in a world of digital, we're actually using technology for the sake of art, right? So yeah, that's an important thought. Brian, what about you?
My suggestion applies equally to administrators, teachers, and students, and that is listen. Administrators, you have to listen to your faculty. That's where the rubber meets the road. Faculty, you have to listen to your students. They think they're always right. You know they're not, but you still have to understand where they're coming from to really understand how to get across the things that you know they need to learn. Students, aspiring professionals, listen to everything. Listen to acoustic music, listen to electronic music, listen to games, listen to movies and television shows, listen to the birds and the wind in the trees, listen to the irritating traffic across the road from you. All of these things have embedded lessons, and EQs and compressors and microphones and mixers are just tools that allow you to take those lessons and make something useful and interesting out of them.
Beautifully said. And Chandler, last but not least.
For students, I think my advice would be to understand how competitive this industry is and to strive for excellence. That really you have to be top of your class, top of your craft. You really have to be excellent in your work to be able to fit in a team, and that most of this is a team sport. And in that vein, like Carlos said, you have to be patient. You're not going to develop your ear in 20 minutes or in a half a year or in a year, and these things take time. And so always striving to do excellent work and do it with patience, I think, is the most important thing for students to focus on. For faculty and administrators, I think it's so important to embrace change. It used to be, how do we make a great sounding mix that'll translate, a stereo mix that'll translate to other speakers? And now we're in this new world. We've been talking about Atmos all day, where it will automatically change the way it sounds. It'll conform to a 7.1 system or a 5.1 system or binaural. And if you submit yourself in ways of the past, you're just doing a disservice to the students, and you just can't exist. It has to be forever moving, and to embrace that new technology, and to work hard to get the administrator support behind that, to give the students what they need to be successful.
I love that. Embrace change. And it certainly, all of us here, seems like, we're doing our best to embrace that change from the different perspectives that we come from. And just to address a question that came in from one of our viewers, I think part of that change from an educational standpoint, at least I think, is making our audio students, our music students, aware that part of what they now need to be thinking about is how to configure IP networks and how to code to some degree, and how to really think about a computer as yet another musical instrument or another tool in their pocket that's not just to watch YouTube or and I'm certainly seeing that a lot with my students at Berklee. Again, it's the ever-changing and ever-evolving gap between an analog audio-driven experience and a digital experience is really that you've got a Swiss Army knife in your pocket when you're dealing with digital audio. With analog audio, you've got a really great blade, but it's kind of just a really great blade. So anyway, with that being said, thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation. Again, I really feel like we could keep going here, and I'm sure there's many questions that we didn't get to. For all of our viewers out there, please feel free to continue to send those questions in, and we'll find the most efficient way, I guess, the most digital way to answer them. And again, thank you so much for to Focusrite and the Focusrite team for putting this together and having us all here.
Well, John, thank you so much. What fun. And to Deanna, to Chandler, to Carlos, and to Brian for Full Sail University and also for Indiana University's Bloomington Jacobs School of Music. We really appreciate all of your support. John, everything that you do with Berklee. And I'm excited. I think we should come back at some point and have that conversation with you and maybe check in with some of your students with that new gear that's in the studios in the music production and engineering department at Berklee. I bet our audience would love to hear more about how that goes. Such exciting times.
I think that would be a great opportunity. I can tell you that my students, we unpacked the rack last night in my last class, and it was, to quote one of my students, it was like Christmas morning. It helps that it's all red gear too. So.
Well, I can't complain about that personally, but thank you. Thank you for everything you do. And Jen, I have one last question for you for our audience, because we're doing this again tomorrow, but it's a little bit different. Tell everybody in the audience before we sign off for today what happens, because we repeat this tomorrow, but we repeat it in Espanol.
That's right. We repeat it with a different flavor. So I think one of the really exciting things about the series with Focusrite Pro here is that we're trying to democratize the knowledge base that we're giving. So we're doing it bilingually. We're doing the series both in English and in Spanish so that it can go to as many people, as far reaching as we can possibly get it within this side of the world that we're in. And, you know, I'm sure it will spread beyond that. And so you can all join us tomorrow again, any of you Spanish speakers or any of you learning Spanish. Join us tomorrow, and we're going to have a similar conversation. Carlos will be with us again tomorrow, and we're going to add a new set of people to have a very similar discussion, but with the Latin American contingent.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, John, from the bottom of my heart. Everyone, this is Lee Whitmore, Vice President for Education at Focusrite Group. For those of you who are not yet on our mailing list, go to pro.focusrite.com/education for more resources and information. Feel free to drop us a line there on anything that you heard about today. Excuse me, any questions that weren't answered. And also at the YouTube channel for Focusrite and for Focusrite Pro, you will find this streamed archive. If you sign up, you'll get the highlights from this conversation and have access to the other episodes in this series. So to everyone, thank you for your time. We appreciate you being here. To our panel, thank you to John, our panel moderator. We'll look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow in Spanish and then in the spring with some new content. So again, from Focusrite Group, which is Focusrite, Focusrite Pro, Novation, Martin Audio, Atom Audio, Optimal Audio, Sequential, and Amplify Music. It's been great having everyone here today. Good luck with the rest of the semester, and everybody stay safe. Thank you.